Hello there, this is Dr. Bob Moorcook at Houston Community College, and today we're going to be talking about the difference between correlations and experiments and why it is that correlations do not allow you to draw a cause and effect conclusion, but an experiment does. So I'm going to push the magic buttons here and come over to a PowerPoint that I have prepared and that hopefully is going to help us deal with this. And the best place to start, of course, is at page number 1. So here we go. What is the difference between these two research methods? Okay, well, first off, all research includes observation. How do you make an observation? You can use one of your 5 traditional senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. You can also, if you like, use an instrument. Then you could take your senses farther than otherwise they could go. If you were an astronomer, you could use a telescope. You could see at a distance. If you were a biologist, you could see a microscope and see small things. In medicine, you could do laboratory testing and observe your results. In psychology, you could do psychological testing and overlapping between psychology and medicine. You could do physiological measurements. You could observe pulse rate, observe brain waves, and observe blood pressure. So, some further quick review here. The different types of research used in psychology. There are the descriptive methods, which are only observation. There's the correlational method, which also is only observation, and the experimental method, which combines manipulating one variable, an independent variable, and observing a second variable, the dependent variable, to see if it changes when you make a change on the independent variable. So, the first method is there, you're only observing. The last method, you're manipulating, changing something, and making an observation. So, in fact, some books would argue, and maybe you noticed a little change there, the now correlational method falls in as a descriptive method because you are only observing and describing, and some textbooks do teach it that way. So, pressing on. Talking about the difference now between a correlation and an experiment. Here's an example using coffee, real coffee versus decaf. On the left-hand side, for a correlational study, participants themselves choose regular or decaffeinated coffee. You're observing whichever they pick. Then the next day you observe their sleepiness, and at number 3, perhaps you observe a pattern that those who drank real coffee are less sleepy or less often sleepy the next day. And at 4, you may not conclude that it was coffee that made the difference. You can observe the difference, but you just can't say that it was because of the caffeine. What do we call the pattern that you see? We call it a correlation. That's another word for a pattern. Okay. Now, what if this particular piece of research was done as an experiment? Well, okay, people volunteer to be in the experiment, and then the researcher himself randomly assigns people to either an experimental group or control group. And then subjects get coffee or decaffeinated coffee according to their group. They did not get to choose which they got. They also don't know which they got. This is the difference. The correlational study, they chose themselves. In the experiment, nope, the researcher randomly assigns them to groups. The next day, you find that the group of folks who got the real coffee are less sleepy. Yes, you may now conclude that it was coffee that made the difference. It was because of the random assignment. That's the difference. Experiment, random assignment, correlational study, people chose themselves. You're only observing them. That was, in fact, the big difference. All right, I should have changed slides here. In the correlational study, participants got to choose for themselves the coffee type. In the experiment, nope, they were randomly assigned to one group or the other by the researcher. So why is it that with the correlational study that you cannot conclude cause and effect? It's because, last bullet point, it's possible that some unknown third factor, something other than coffee type, was at work, and that this third unknown thing was the real cause of the difference in sleepiness. You did find a difference in sleepiness, but it may be some third thing which maybe you can figure out and maybe you cannot. So here's a first example at numero uno there of what might have been the difference. Perhaps people who buy personal physical makeup, because we are a little different from each other, are very alert. And because they're very alert, something about this just causes them to prefer coffee with caffeine. Another possibility at number two is that maybe people with a more relaxed style don't like real coffee because it makes them nervous and it would keep them from their afternoon nap. So it can be physical makeup. And of course, since it's unknown, there could be some other things as well. So here's what real researchers do. They start off with ordinary observations and then they bump it up to correlations. And then they start thinking, well, maybe cause and effect is here. Maybe I'll bump it up and do an experiment next time if it's worthwhile. Well, Dr. Moorcook, you say, can you give me another example of how a third unknown factor can be the cause of a real correlation? So, from class lectures, remember that there is a correlation between ice cream sales at the beach and shark attacks at the beach. When ice cream sales go up, so do shark attacks. When sales decrease, so do shark attacks. That's true, that's a fact. Now, that's because when ice cream is for sale at the beach, it's warmer outside because that's when the guys go out to sell ice cream. And that's when people go to the beach too, because if nobody's at the beach, you're not going to sell any ice cream. Okay. People buy more ice cream in the warm weather too. All right. So these two things are correlated because of a third factor, warm weather versus cold weather. When the temperature goes up, people go to the beach and you sell more ice cream. So you would never want to conclude that or think that, gee, if we just stopped selling so much ice cream at the beach, we wouldn't have so many shark attacks. They're correlated, but there's not a cause and effect relationship. Can you give me another example, you say, of how a third factor could be the cause of a correlation? Okay, from class lecture. True. Older children usually spell better on spelling tests than younger children. Say an 8 or 12-year-old spells better usually than a 4-year-old, of course. Okay. So as children age from 4 to 12 years, their scores on spelling the same words on a test will improve. So their pattern is a correlation. But does getting older cause you to become a better speller? No, it does not. Otherwise, we'd just sit around and do nothing, and we'd improve because, we got older. Duh. Then what's the third unknown factor of the real cause of becoming a better speller? I guess it's not really unknown. It's really years of education, and we can figure that out. So, no, getting older will not make you a better speller, but going to school usually will. What do you mean, a third unknown factor? Can you give me another example? Well, okay. Their birth rate goes up in the summertime. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Birds are returned during the summer. There's more birds around. The stork is a bird. So when the stork is around, there's more babies being born. So there's a correlation there, isn't there? The more storks there are, the more babies there are. The fewer storks there are, the fewer babies there are. Does that mean the storks are bringing babies? Some people think so, but you usually stop believing that when you're 5 or 6 or 8. Okay. My dad used to tell me they found me under a rock. I think I would rather have been brought by a stork. Okay, storks don't bring babies. So here we go. Now let's get back on the serious side. It is true that, on average, people who exercise usually live longer than people who do not exercise. But the research on this is all correlational. In other words, trust me, science cannot say that exercising will cause you to live longer, but we can predict that if you exercise, you will probably live longer. So let's take a look at why these are correlational studies. It's because participants themselves and the research choose whether they're going to exercise more or less. And if you're the researcher, then you simply observe how much exercise people get and how long they live. And you find a pattern that there is a relationship that people who exercise more usually do live longer. But you may not conclude that it's the exercise that's making the difference. This is a correlational study. Now, if you were to do an experiment on this, And you can't do it based on some practical things. Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. Then participants would simply volunteer to be an experiment to see if exercise will cause a person to live longer. Then the researcher would randomly assign people to either the exercise group or the no exercise group. And they would have to agree to stay in that group for the rest of their life. You want to exercise? No, too bad. You volunteered to be in the research. You will never exercise for the rest of your life. No fair, you say. I say, well, you volunteered. Obviously, you could drop out, and people are going to drop out. So, random assignment for the rest of your life into a group is just not going to work. Okay. So, for practical reasons, this is just not doable. But there is a correlation. So then, what might be the third unknown reason why people who exercise more live longer? Which is true? Well, first off, there is an association. That's just a fancy word for correlation. Next slide is going to get into that. Okay. So what might be the real cause of a longer life if exercise is not it? Well, it could be that people who exercise more are more health conscious, so they eat a healthier diet. Yeah, we didn't control for diet. If we'd used random assignment, this would have controlled for that. 2, people who exercise may be paying more attention to their quality sleep and getting better sleep, or maybe both of 1 and 2. 3, people who exercise more may also be taking appropriate vitamins because they're paying more attention to their health. That's why they choose to exercise. Or number 4 is a real killer here, and that is that people who exercise may be doing so because they're already healthier. And so they just feel like exercising. And people who are less healthy just don't feel like doing it. And if you're less healthy, then you tend to die a bit sooner. So, and on top of that, there could be some other unknown factors as well. These are just the ones that I was able to creatively generate on my own. Your turn. Okay. So, a summary here. Correlational studies detect patterns, and the patterns might include cause and effect, but you can never be sure. In a correlational study, people are not assigned to conditions by the researcher. They choose the conditions themselves, exercise or no exercise, coffee with caffeine or coffee without caffeine, or perhaps their choices imposed by nature itself, such as age, race, or gender. Okay, I'm 77. Nobody could ever randomly assign me to the 18-year-old group. That's just not possible because I'm always going to be 77 until I'm 78. Now, experiments do detect cause and effect. This is because people are assigned to conditions, experimental or control groups, at random. And this business of adding random assignment allows a researcher to make statements about cause and effect. So that's the big deal. That's the big difference between correlations and experiments. I hope this has helped you understand the difference between the two. The difference is real. The difference is important. Thank you very much. This is Bob Moorcook for Houston Community College. Bye now.